the Churches of Christ present Bible Talk.
Life is full of difficulty, even for the righteous. But how should we respond to the difficulties or the giants in our lives? Well, we really only have two choices. Either we remain steadfast or we can surrender. But that choice will be the topic of our study today. So stay tuned after this song of praise. Hello again, and thank you for tuning in to Bible Talk. What a great blessing it is to be able to open God's Word and to study with you today. It's always our prayer here at Bible Talk that these studies will help you to draw closer to God and to His will for our lives, as He has given us in His Word all things that pertain to life and godliness. In Numbers chapter 13, we find Israel on the cusp of the Promised Land. You know, that they're right there. And it's here where all that they've longed for since the time that Moses came and said to Pharaoh, "Let my people go," from the time really that God made His promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, everything that they've been longing for in the fulfillment of those promises is hanging in the balance. We read that the name of the place is Kadesh Barnea, where they're gathered together. It was a place in the desert. The name Kadesh Barnea literally means a desert place. And it's here in this desert place where Israel has a decision to make. Do we press on with steadfastness, or do we surrender because there are giants in the land? Today I want us to think about patience or steadfastness in respect to the difficulties, the giants, if you will, that we may face throughout the course of our lives. As we think about patience and steadfastness or perseverance, there are going to be times in our lives where we find ourselves seemingly in a desert place, a place where we feel alone. And the same question will need to be answered. Will we press on with patience, or will we resign ourselves and give up, give in, or give out? I want to notice with you first today the text, the passage of our study. And in Numbers chapter 13, it begins with a charge from God, verses 1 through 3, a charge that comes from God basically telling the people to search out the land. Notice with me Numbers 13 and verses 1 through 3. "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Send thou men, that they may search the land of Canaan, which I give unto the children of Israel. Of every tribe of their fathers shall ye send a man, every one a ruler among them. And Moses, by the commandment of the Lord, sent them from the wilderness of Paran, all those men who were heads of the children of Israel." And so the charge comes while Israel is in Kadesh Barnea, in this desert place, for there to be chief men, the chiefest men among them, one from every tribe, to go into the land and to see what the land is. They're to search the land for the purpose of proving God. In other words, you go back to the very beginning of this promise in Genesis chapter 12, and from the beginning God has promised that it was going to be a land which flowed with milk and honey, that it was going to be a great land. And notice what's said in verses 18 through 20 of Numbers 13. At verse 18, this again part of the charge from God given to Moses, then given to these 12 spies, says in verse 18, "See the land, what it is, and the people that dwelleth therein, whether they be strong or weak, few or many, and what the land is that they dwell in, whether it be good or bad, and what cities they be that they dwell in, whether in tents or in strongholds, and what the land is, whether it be fat or lean, whether there be wood therein or not, and be ye of good courage, and bring of the fruit of the land." And said, now the time was the time of the first ripe grapes. In other words, they're being sent into the land to see if the land is what God said it would be. This was the charge then. God is saying to them, go in the land, test my word, see if it's not exactly what I told you it would be. In Exodus 3 and verse 8, God said that it would be a good land and a large land, and a land which flows with milk and honey. Now God is saying, you go into the land and see if it's not exactly what I told you it would be. But secondly, in our text, we see then the confirmation of the charge. Notice Numbers 13 and verse 27. These 12 spies, they've gone into the land. They've spent 40 days there. Now they've come back. In verse 27 it says, and they told him, this is their report to Moses and to others. And it says, they told him and said, we came unto the land whither thou sentest us, and surely it floweth with milk and honey, and this is the fruit of it. They return with glorious confirmation of what God said. God said it's a great land, a large land, a land which flows with milk and honey. They come back and they said, yes, it's exactly what God said it would be. What we should see follow is praise and rejoicing. God has kept His promises. God said He would deliver us, and He has. God said He would bring us to this land, and He has. God said it's a land belonging to these people, and it is. God said it flows with milk and honey, and it does. And even more so, here are the fruits of it in our very hands. The evidence of God's promises in their hands. They should be ready to fight whatever battle comes. God brought us to it, He'll bring us through it, right? That's the kind of mentality that we should see. But instead, number 3, we see the cowardice. We see them turn from their bravery, from their courage, and turn to cowardice. You ever heard the expression, anything after but is never good? Well, the same is true in Numbers chapter 13. They're saying here is the fruit of it, here's the evidence that we need, but then verse 28, King James Version begins with the word nevertheless, but the idea there is that it begins with the word but. Here's the evidence of it all, but, notice verses 28 and 29, but the people be strong that dwell in the land, and the cities are walled and very great. And moreover, we saw the children of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the south, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and by the coast of Jordan. Drop down to verse 31, and it reads, but the men that went up with him said, we be not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. And they brought up an evil report of the land which they had searched unto the children of Israel, saying, the land through which we have gone to search it is a land that eateth up the inhabitants thereof, and all the people that we saw in it are men of great stature. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants. And we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. I want you to notice the phrase in verse 32, and they brought up an evil report of the land. They've gone into the land according to God's charge. See if it's not what I told you it would be. They come back with the confirmation before Moses. Here are the fruits of the land. It's exactly what God promised. But then their cowardice led them to make up a story about the land to say that they couldn't go in and take it. Here they are with the evidence in their hands, and all they have to do is remain steadfast, patient, and press on. But their doubts and their fears, the unknown, and all of these things rob them of their courage and their patience, and they choose not to go in. Their decision was not left without a challenge. We see a challenge from Caleb and Joshua. Numbers 13 and verse 30, Caleb stills the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once and possess it, for we are well able to overcome it." In Numbers chapter 14 and verses 6 through 9, again, Caleb and Joshua together do what they can to try to encourage people, saying, "Hey, listen, the inhabitants of the land, they are bread for us because God is with us." What are they doing? They're challenging them. They're pleading with them. Don't do this. Don't give up. God is on our side. But then you see the choice. 10 spies and the whole congregation choose rather to surrender instead of being steadfast. Notice Numbers 14 and verses 1 through 4. All the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept that night, and all the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron. And the whole congregation said to them, "Would God that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would God we had died in this wilderness? Therefore hath the Lord brought us unto this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and our children should be a prey. Were it not better for us to return into Egypt?" And they said one to another, "Let us make a captain, and let us return into Egypt." This is one of those, as I'm reading it, one of those moments where you read the text and you're just kind of, thinking to yourself, are you kidding me? You'd rather flee here and go back into bondage of Egypt? These individuals, by the way, they say it would have been better for us to have died in this wilderness. They're going to get that wish. These individuals will never receive the land of promise. Every member of this generation from 20 years old and upward is going to perish in the wilderness wandering as this nation of God's people wanders for 40 years, 1 year for every day spent in the land, because of their cowardice, because of their choice to surrender instead of being steadfast and pressing on. Caleb and Joshua chose patience. These two would later receive their inheritance, Joshua chapter 14. But everyone else in that generation would perish. That's the text of our consideration today. But what does that text mean to us? I'll share with you, secondly, the test, the application for our lives. How can I prepare my soul to press on when I find myself in a desert place where there are giants and challenges of life that I'm going to be facing? How can I ensure that I'm ready to press on and not surrender as they did? Number one, we need to remember the certainty of God's promises. God has kept every promise that He's ever made. And this text in Numbers 13 just highlights that fact. Yes, they decided not to go on after God's promises, but notice what they found. God said this is what the land is, and they found that it was exactly what God promised it would be. Let me encourage you sometime in your personal study to do a study of the promises of God. And every time you see God make a promise, you will see a fulfillment of that promise, save those that have yet to be fulfilled. But when God said, "I will," He did. Number two, we need to realize that there are giants in our lives. There are things in every man's life that challenge us, that are going to produce fear and worry and doubt. It would be foolish of us to think that there are no giants for us to face today. Now, our giants are different. We've not been charged by God to go into a land that we've not yet been into and to face physical giants and fight physical battles and have physical warfare. Our charge is different. But we do have giants, we do have difficulties and obstacles to overcome if we ultimately want to receive the great fulfillment of God's promises. Think about some of the giants that we may face today. Giants like what I call I can't imagine situations. You know, these situations we find ourselves at times in life, these tragic events. A young children, teenager and younger children, for example, maybe perhaps on their way to school, being killed in a car wreck, and we just think, I can't imagine what they must be going through. Things that we don't even like to think about or contemplate. And yet these situations are happening to people every day. And in those moments when we're in a desert place, in these I can't imagine situations, we have a choice to make. To either surrender or to remain steadfast. It's a difficult choice, but one that must be made. Think about giants that appear as trouble in the home, strives between husbands and wives, adultery being committed by one party in the home, financial struggles leading to trouble in the home, differences over opinion and the rearing of children bringing about trouble. These are all situations that Christians face every day. And they're situations where our faith is put to the test. Think about our struggles with sin. We still have struggles with sin and temptation. James said every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust and enticed. As long as man has lust, there will be the enticement to sin. And that enticement will be there until the Lord returns. Those struggles with sin test our faith. Think about our giants of self-doubt and insecurity. You know, the thought of, I'm not good enough, or I can't do it, or is God mindful of me? These ideas of self-doubt and insecurity test our faith. Selfishness is one of the greatest giants that we face. The giant of looking out for number one above all and above everything else. By the way, Christianity challenges us to be selfless like our Lord. If we're going to do that, we have to overcome the giant of selfishness. We have to overcome the giant of weariness, growing weary in well-doing. The Lord understood that. God understood it as He inspired the Apostle Paul to write, "Be not weary in well-doing, for in due season ye shall reap, if ye faint not." Galatians chapter 6. We have to deal with the giants of idleness, I-D-L-E, and idleness, I-D-O-L. We have to deal with the giants of sitting idle, being content and lazy and lackadaisical, and the giant of having some idol, something that we've given greater importance in our lives than we've given to Christ and His church. Now, friends, that's not an all-inclusive list. Those are just a few of the things. These are some of the real struggles, the real battles, real giants that people are facing on a daily basis. And if we don't identify these threats and recognize them, then they can produce the greatest enemy to our patience, that being fear. Fear is a thief that robs you of your service to God and faithfulness to Him. These things, if not addressed, can produce that great enemy to our patience. Then in the third place, we need to recognize the challenges of our giants and our fears. That is, we have these giants, we have these challenges in our lives, but notice what they do. They can, if we allow them, cause us to have an improper focus. The Israelites could not see God because of their giants. Now Caleb and Joshua are trying to tell them, listen, God is with us. The people, even these giants, they are bread for us because God is on our side. But the other 10 and the whole camp could not see God because their focus was on the giants. Their focus turned, we might say, number one, to themselves. Numbers 13 and verse 33. They said that we were but grasshoppers in our sight, and so we were in theirs also. Their focus turned from God and began to look inward. begin to look at themselves. And here's the truth. By ourselves, we don't stand a chance. But here's the thing. We're not alone. And that's what Caleb and Joshua were trying to say. That was their whole point. Yes, friends, if we're looking at ourselves and we're looking at the giants, we don't stand a chance. But God is with us, and God is greater than any giant. Whatever we're going through, whatever we're facing, God is bigger. I love the words of David in 1 Samuel 17 and verse 37. When David said, He delivered me from the paw of the lion, He delivered me from the paw of the bear, and He'll deliver me from this giant's hand also. Keep our focus on God. Don't let the giants and a view of ourselves keep us from focusing on how great and how big our God is. But number two, our giants and the fears that they produce can cause the promises of God to seem insignificant. The great difficulties that we face, the giants of life, have a way of making the promises of God seem insignificant. I mean, think about where they are in Numbers 13. Here they were with the promises in their hand. This is the fruit of it. And yet those promises were insignificant to their choice because of the giants and because of their fear. Friends, we must remain focused on His promises. 2 Peter 3 and verse 9 tells us that the Lord is not slack concerning His promises, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering to us. We're not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. Keep your focus on God and keep your focus on His promises. Remember Romans chapter 8, which tells us that nothing can separate us from the love of God. Not people, because if God be for us, who can be against us? And not the perils of life, because in all these things we are more than conquerors through Him that loved us. I know that in the moment, in this desert place where we may find ourselves, there may seem to be that the promises are insignificant. But look back over the course of your life, and you'll see time and time again where God has promised to bring you through, and He has. Then number three, they can cause us to take influence from the wrong places or the wrong people. How things could have been different for this generation if they'd only listened to Caleb and Joshua instead of the other 10. Instead of turning to God and seeking answers from His Word, we sometimes turn to the advice of the world. And the world says if your marriage is struggling, leave. The world says if you're not happy, do whatever makes you happy. The world says there's nothing wrong with your sin. The world says life is too short to struggle and to fight and to labor, so just live to make yourself happy. But I promise you, friends, if the focus is on self, if I fail to see the significance of God's promises, and if I allow myself to be influenced by the wrong things, then patience, steadfastness is an impossibility. And ultimately realize the choice is ours. We can either turn back, we can give up, give in, or give out, or we can press on. We think about how foolish they were to say, let's go back into bondage of Egypt. Let's turn back. Let's go back into the bondage of Egypt and not face these giants. How much more foolish is it of us when we come to our giants to say, let us turn back to the bondage of sin instead of pressing on, knowing that God is greater, holding on, clinging to the promises of His Word, and moving on, heeding His Word, and pressing toward. In a desert place, Kadesh Barnea, they had a choice to make. And in our desert places, we'll have to make the same choice. A place where we may feel down and alone and facing one of the giants of life. Will we press on? Will we be steadfast? Or will we surrender? I pray that today's lesson has been a blessing to you. As always, thank you for tuning in, and God bless. Do you have any questions about the Bible? Are you searching for a place to worship God like you find in the Bible? Do you have questions about your eternity? Would you like to know more about God's plan for you? Let me encourage you to visit a Church of Christ near you today. And if you're interested in learning more about the Lord's Church, we also offer free material. For more information, or if you would like to have a transcript or a copy of today's program, whether audio or video, please go to our website at www.bible-talk.org, or you can email us at bible.talk@bible-talk.org. You can also write to us at Bible Talk, P.O. Box 40, Fayette, Alabama 35555. Simply include the program number, and we'll be happy to send that to you completely free of charge. Thank you again for tuning in, and may God bless you richly in your walk with Him.
Singing provided by the Edmond Church of Christ, Edmond, Oklahoma, producers of In Search of the Lord's Way. You can visit their website at www.searchtv.org.